then it is the less professional tendencies within journalism which should be nurtured, encouraged and taught, rather than the dogmatic articulation of easily exploited professional strictures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was indeed extremely interesting and heavily loaded, let's say, with a lot of suggestions you're making here about the Australian journalism, war journalism reporting, and perhaps continuing on that conversation about whether journalism should be based on some idealized normative values, or whether the reality calls for the practice of journalism.
The argument I'm trying to get out there is that if we talked about journalism in different terms, then we might actually be able to do it differently. If there was more public understanding, if you like, and less public legitimacy invested in notions of objectivity and impartiality and so forth, if we actually were able to change the way we discuss journalism, then perhaps different forms of journalism, more progressive ways of doing things can be enacted. I know straight away you get into problems of sensationalism and highly commercialised news and all these kinds of things, but that's kind of the direction I'm heading in with this argument.
And there is a lot of conversation about for all practices and forms of journalism, that we need to accept the reality, and that, you know, we can't do it in an objective manner. No. So, you know, is the journalist then aware that that's a situation? And if you're aware, then you...
I think journalists are aware, and they don't act that way anyway. In their actual day-to-day lives, they're constantly making selective decisions and using their subjectivity and bringing all their values, all these kinds of things to bear. They're in a certain place. They're dependent on certain sources. All these problems, which they are very much aware of, right? They know that they have to write a certain number of these kinds of stories so that the editor gets fill for page 3 or whatever it is. But they don't say that. They talk about objectivity, impartiality, balance, fair and balanced. We report, you decide. I mean, I know that's Fox News, but these kinds of ideas, right, continue to provide the discipline with its public.
It's what we used to measure their performance, that we actually should admit.
Perhaps we could measure their performance in different ways, you know?
Yeah. Before I take over the conversation, any questions?
Just a question.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask how many of the 25 interviewees were female, and did they change their perspective?
Yes. A very big disclaimer in my thesis is that unfortunately there were no women involved. There were some Australian women who did report, but for the ones that I could identify for the mainstream, how should we say, premier news organisations in Australia, and I've taken that, like I said, somewhat arbitrarily to be News, Fairfax and the ABC, I could only track down one woman, whose name I can't, Catherine somebody, who worked for News Limited, but she was actually a freelancer brought in to cover the war, and I couldn't get in touch with her. She was in Beirut at the time, and so unfortunately, no female voices, which is a major shortcoming I feel in my research. But
it would reflect that people who are actually covering it are mainly males. And
the whole chapter in my thesis where I discuss what makes a good journalist, right? And to a large extent, it's the one who can deliver the organisational needs, right? So the editors, when you say, like, who did you send? They say, oh, we sent our eldest, most respected, ones who've been around a long time, ones who knew the story, all these kinds of things. And when you consider all those things, longevity, respect, had other opportunities to do it, it's likely that there aren't going to be very many women in that pool of available people, due to the way, you know, news organisations run themselves, I think. But having said that, I think on the basis of my understanding of thinking about journalism, I would speculate that perhaps women probably think about it in much the same ways as men do, in terms of their practice of the occupation, right, the profession, because I think I'm not going out on a limb, but sort of speculating a little bit here, because they've come through the same organisational culture. They're naturalised into the same ways of talking about the job, talking about the profession. Just like if you go, I think if you go and interview or talk to a female CEO these days, she will reproduce a lot of the time the same sorts of, you know, corporate discourse that a male CEO will reproduce. I don't know. Does that sound? I don't know.
Socialised.
Yeah. I mean, and again, a woman within these organisations, a woman is only going to rise to the top if she can demonstrate and act out being a good professional in certain ways.
Or
right?
male professional.
Yeah.
Let's make that clear.
Yeah, I mean, it might be interesting actually to do a study of women journalists before they actually become into the system, if you like. I don't know, maybe that would be revealing. I'm not sure.
Elena?
Well, I have two questions, listening for sort of very interesting and informative presentation, not informal. In terms of when you talk to these journalists, because yes, they have to do this kind of according to the party line, but at the same time, does any of them construct their own blogs or write diaries, like Diary of War Journalist or something like that? So are there any forms of sort of discourse which come out?
Yeah, there are.
Yeah.
And they write the book, right?
Yeah.
When they come home, they write the book.
Yes.
And in the book, you get all manner of subjective insights and details about oftentimes the absurdity of war, right? The ridiculous things that go on during a campaign and so forth, which never make it into don't make it into the daily news narrative, right? But when you compare the timelines between what's going on in terms of because this is quite a straightforward timeline, right? A month of a military invasion. And you can compare that with the narrative in the book and say, in this period, these sorts of things were happening, but it was not reported in the same way.
But is it possible to say that this also contributes to its construction of war journalist professional?
Indeed.
Professionalism?
Indeed.
Are the discourses which actually are not there officially on newspapers, but will be later on presented by them?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there are. Yeah, but I think if I understand your question, well, my argument would be, well, why aren't these other details included into the daily news narrative, right? Because who reads the book? People like me who are interested in it, and other people who are interested in it. But the daily news, when it's the Iraq War, it's 10-page colour supplements. It's, you know, special editions. It's right there. Everyone's glued to their televisions and their radios, and everyone's buying the newspaper to find what's going on. And these stories were not these stories were the analysis of the news I did was, you know, the leading news outlets in Australia, and also prominent stories, right? Page 1, page 2, front page world section, these kinds of things.
It's misdirecting, isn't it, when you present it as the objective representation of the war. Well, in fact, it is a personal observation.
Indeed. The argument being, if we were more clear about that, then perhaps we could do other things, right? And that would be accepted as...
And I have another question with this as well. Did you look in doing your thesis as well? Because it's like the official sort of information is only one source of information, how we construct our images about certain realities. So from this point of view, did you look how important it is to sort of do it the way they do, official journalists do it? Because we have blogs, we have all other sort of sources there. So they're losing the plot probably.
So what's the last
I mean, when you write this official group, according to the guidelines basically provided by sort of the government, it's not really getting so many readers. It's sort of...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, less and less, I'm not really sure. I treat sort of the new media, the social media, and the electronic, the blogging, the blogosphere, with a little bit of caution, I think.
Sure.
No, that wasn't part of my study, so I totally appreciate that there are other ways of understanding the same events out there, maybe even written by the same people, right? But I actually think the impact of those things, those outlets, those formats, if you like, far exceeded by the mainstream news organisations, which really drive the news agenda, which most people... I'm interested in public information, I'm interested in how the mass public understand what's going on. I've been interested, and I think this might be something that I should perhaps do some research on in the future, the extent to which, you know, the Twitter world and the blogosphere and so forth an alternative public sphere when in the mainstream news there's such a superficial, the political issues, the most very important issues, are extremely superficially covered, right? The size of someone's earlobes and whether or not someone is getting done for sexual misconduct, all these kinds of things, right? And in Australia, there's a very, very, very vibrant online community of Twitterers and bloggers and so forth. And so there's this idea that maybe there is an alternative public sphere going on where you can get the real good stuff, right? But when you look at who actually uses, and it's a little bit of an echo chamber. It's the same people talking to each other. It's academics, it's journalists, it's Australian journalists from the ABC and from News and all the rest of it with their little outlet. It's politicians, it's some keen members of the public, but it's not the same as the Sydney Morning Herald or the ABC. It's simply not the same, of the same scale. I don't think. I think it's maybe a fruitful line of research.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because, you know, with the beginning of the new technologies, we started discussing perhaps the public sphere is shifting into these new spaces. However, there is nothing that can replace that action of waking up in the morning, getting your coffee, and open that national newspaper, perhaps not in New Zealand, but in the rest of the world. And you know that at the same time, millions of other people would be reading the same piece of news.
Yes, or just looking on the radio and hearing the headline news, right?
So, you know, perhaps that is going to keep happening. What is the impact, though, of the new technology?
The other question is to us, if you have this, like in Australia, there's a very vibrant world of academics, lots of media academics, lots of journalists and academics and so forth, lots of journalists, lots of politicians and political types, so people who work for political parties, PR type people, all those kinds of people. They're all talking to each other. To what extent does that then re-fertilise the traditional public sphere, if you like? Now it should do, right? Because it's all the same people who have got the power, the access into the public sphere. You know, it's the main reporters from the ABC and the main reporters from the big papers and so forth. So I think these are all very interesting questions, isn't it?
Indeed, perhaps some of our master students want to do that. Any other questions you might have?
Just like to say the self-censorship, how different for war correspondents that you discussed this with, how different would that be from journalists working in a totalitarian regime where, you know, they are circumscribed in what they say?
Well, like I've been trying to suggest, embedding, for instance, is the military media strategy for the age in which there is scepticism towards traditional authority, scepticism towards military political authority. So it's not the same kind of censorship, but it's structuring the experience in such a way that certain kinds of perspectives will be privileged, certain kinds of values will be re-articulated. So it's a different kind of, I wouldn't even go so far as to say censorship, I would say producing a kind of reality, if you like, fundamentally structured in accordance with the embedding guidelines, with the Department of Defence's intention, right?
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I was delighted to hear some fresh research indicating we need to move away from the normative values of measuring media into alternative ways of practicing journalism.
Okay, thank you.